Hey everyone, Tin Man here, and today we're going to be talking about my favorite Underlord in Dota Underlords right now, Anessix. Anessix plays kind of like a support unit who heals your units, summons companions to fight for her, and casts damaging and disabling spells on your enemies. In this guide, we're going to cover the general strategies, the pros and cons, talent choices, as well as positioning tips specific to the Underlord Anessix. Now, compared to the other available Underlord Hobgen, Anessix has a much stronger early game strength. Her healing is very impactful in the early game fights, and her damage output is very respectable as well. By the late game though, her stats start to fall off a little bit, as the healing is less important, and her late game talents are not quite as impactful as Hobgen's. Now, for alliances that you want to pair with, you definitely want a lot of demons to pair with Anessix, as they increase her hype generation, and her companions that she summons count as demons when triggering the demon alliance. She pairs best with healers to increase her healing output, as well as with warriors and knights, whose damage reduction effect make her healing that much more effective. And she can also work with mages to grant extra mana, or she can also work with hunters and assassins by foregoing healing to deal more damage, although these are a little bit less optimal than the healers, warriors, and knights. Alright, for pros and cons, obviously the pros is her early game strength and the healing synergy with so many different popular alliances, and also has a very flexible choice of talents throughout the game. On the con side, definitely going to be a little bit weaker in late game compared to Hobgen, and she strongly prefers the demon units, which don't necessarily fit into every single build. Also, the positioning, which we'll discuss a little bit later, can be kind of tricky with the way her summons work and to not box yourself in accidentally. In terms of talent choices, these are going to be one of the most important choices throughout the game. Every 5 rounds, you'll get the choice of different talents. On round 10, you've got the choice of Brill Bruiser, Chaotic Hunter, Arcane Ritual, and the End of Medicine. Now, Brill Bruiser is probably the worst in this tier, and it's probably the worst of any of her talents, as it's actively detrimental a lot of the time. The Bruiser demons themselves are actually pretty reasonable, but they are constrained to melee range, and they'll constantly stay adjacent to Anessix, meaning if there are no enemies nearby, they're just going to stand there and look silly instead of actually dealing damage and getting into combat. So you probably want to avoid this talent. Chaotic Hunter, this is probably the go-to talent in this tier. It's just a straight upgrade to Anessix's companions, increasing the DPS substantially with no downside at all. Unless you're sure you want one of the modifications to Martyr's Boon, you should probably just default to Chaotic Hunter. Arcane Ritual, this talent can be useful if you see yourself going towards more of a mage composition, or any build that has a lot of casters who are mana hungry. Generally, it'll be less useful in the early game than a damage increase from Chaotic Hunter, but it can definitely be valuable in the late game to ensure your army gets more spells off during a long fight. The End of Medicine, this talent's kind of risky as you trade the solid healing for increased attack damage. If you're using hunters or assassin compositions who really want that bonus attack damage, then it can be a pretty reasonable pick, but the healing in the early game is just so powerful that you often don't want to give that up to commit to kind of a sort of glass cannon build so early on in the game. On round 15, you'll have the choice of Broken Hearts, Broken Bones, Sharp Pain, Despite All My Rage, and Confidence Boost. Now, for Broken Heart, Broken Bones, this talent can be massively impactful if Pure Pain affects the highest priority target, significantly limiting them for the 6-second duration of Pure Pain. But it can also be fairly useless if Pure Pain hits a unit who has few of the alliance bonuses or passives to break. The other talents in this tier are going to be a little bit more popular just because they're more consistently useful. Sharp Pain, this is an upgrade to the damage output of Pure Pain, and it's just like Chaotic Hunter, it's pretty consistent, it's just a good damage increase, and it's often kind of the default pick here just because it is so consistent. Despite All My Rage, if you take this talent, you ideally want to have your companions constantly dying in combat so they respawn and become more and more powerful than before. And that can be kind of difficult to ensure since most of the opponent's spells and effects will prefer to target Anessix herself rather than her companions. Ideally, you position her closer to the front and hope that most opponents attack her companions, but that is a little bit risky as she's exposed to opponents as well. Confidence Boost, this is primarily a late game talent that is really good at accelerating Anessix to her ultimate, which is not unlocked until round 20. Unfortunately, her ultimate options are really not that strong, at least not until you unlock another upgrade for them on round 35, so only really pick this talent if you're sure you're going to make it to the late game. For round 20, these are her ultimate abilities that are cast once you get up to 100 hype, so you won't cast these until pretty late on into the fight, or you can accelerate it early with confidence boosts, as we just mentioned. Enthrall, this talent is most preferred if most of your damage comes from ranged units like Hunters or Arc Warden, but if most of your units are melee, they're going to spend a lot of time moving around trying to reach the target who's enthralled, rather than just continuing to attack their current targets. So this effect can be quite strong. You're going to steal an enemy unit for your board if you can successfully kill them off, but if you don't get it off, then it's kind of just a wasted detriment to your team as you gave them a free taunt and you kind of stop DPS on everyone else for a little bit. Summon Demonic Golem, this talent's a bit more straightforward. It summons a large golem who can tank some hits and deal some damage, but it's kind of unimpressive at both. This talent plays well with some of the upgrades on round 35, but on its own, it really is just kind of lackluster compared to Enthrall. On round 25, you've got the option of Exploit Weakness, which is a good option if the opponents are running strong defensive alliances like Warriors or Knights, as the break effect will remove that bonus, making them very vulnerable. Against builds like Mages, it's a little bit less impactful since their important units are generally out of reach of your companion's attacks. Transfusion, this is probably the worst of this tier since Pure Pain doesn't really do a ton of damage, and so you won't be healing all that much. And by the time Anessix and her companions are really taking damage that you want to heal, they're probably about to be killed pretty quickly, even with this healing. Phantom Pain, this is a pretty powerful armor buff for your entire team. All of your units, not just Anessix and her companions, every one of your units gets this buff. While it only lasts the increased armor for about 6 seconds of the Pure Pain, this really can be critical against high physical damage lineups like Assassins or Hunters who are looking to burn you down quickly. Instant Regret, this is a really strong effect that can definitely help you if you're slightly behind and losing rounds. You can easily turn a few lost units who die early on in the fight into a huge advantage if the opposing key carries, such as like a Troll Warlord, Chaos Knight, or Slark, get the kill and then are broken for the rest of the fight. It won't be as consistent as Exposed Weakness or Phantom Pain, but it can be very effective if it works. On round 30, you've got Demon's Revenge. If you chose Despite All My Rage, the one which respawns your demons ever stronger each time, this can make a lot of sense, as you want to have your companions killed off very quickly. This encourages you to play Anessix more forward, as we mentioned before, and exposing her to more danger, but the payoff is definitely substantial with a big chunk of damage and the break coming out every time one of your companions dies. Heavy Wounds, unless you know for sure that the enemy is going to have a lot of healing on their team, Heavy Wounds is generally going to be weaker than Sympathy Pains, just because the single target is not as important, and the healing debuff only lasts for 6 seconds. Sympathy Pains, on the other hand, this is probably the best pick in the tier. It's going to double the damage output from Pure Pain. It is a little bit less effective if the enemy has AoE healing, like a Necrophos, who can negate the damage on the multiple targets, but in general, it's probably the go-to pick. Small Wound, this is probably the worst option in the tier, as the health cost from Martyr's Boon is not really relevant, since Anessix just heals herself after casting it anyway. If you chose the End of Medicine on round 10, which removes the healing, this might make a bit more sense, but even then I think there's better options on this tier. And the final set of talent choices on round 35, you've got Fully Refreshed. And this talent modifies your Enthrall ultimate ability, and it's pretty strong if you're getting a unit like Tidehunter or Kunkka or somebody with a high impact ultimate, but it's totally useless if you get like a damage dealer like a Drow Ranger or Phantom Assassin with Enthrall. This inconsistency makes it a little bit less desirable than Bring It Down. Bring It Down, on the other hand, since you only have a limited target to kill that enthralled target, it will ensure that if they're broken for that duration, it's a lot easier to get the kill, removing any of their defensive alliances. And then you get back the unit, getting back the unit with full mana, with Fully Refreshed, is just a little bit less important than actually making sure you get it in the first place. So Bring It Down is my preferred pick if you are using Enthrall. If you have chosen Summon Demonic Golem, on the other hand, you've got the option of Crash or Absolute Unit. Crash is a great option if there are stacked opponents like Hunters or Mages who the Golem can stun upon casting. The Golem itself will still be somewhat weak, but the AoE stun is always going to be welcome in the late game. Absolute Unit, this talent is a bit better in more spread out fights, such as against opposing Assassins or Warriors who've got a lot of melee, a lot of different things happening. The double health total really makes him a reasonable tank and can buy time for the rest of your damage dealers to catch up and win the fight for you. Let's talk about positioning for a little bit. The most important thing about Anessix positioning is make sure that you understand that where her companion is going to spawn, and so that it's in the correct position to be the most effective. In general, the companion will prefer to spawn directly in front, in square 1 listed here. But if that spot is occupied, it'll be spawned directly behind her instead, which is square 2. Squares 1A and 1B are used only if the opponent is in range, but they're off to the side. So if the opponent is stacked up, say on the right-hand side, Anessix won't spawn the companion in square 1, it'll be in 1B, just so that unit doesn't have to walk as soon as it's summoned. It can just spawn and then immediately start autoing attacking at range. But if there is somebody closer to Anessix, then she'll still spawn in spot 1. After that, it'll prefer to spawn in the squares labeled 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in that order. Additionally, if Anessix is placed on the front side of your board, she'll try to spawn her companion directly in front of her unless there's an enemy within the squares directly in front of her, and that squares that was 1, 1A, and 1B. You see, in this example, the opposing axe is directly adjacent to Anessix at the start of the fight, so her companion will spawn behind her. But compare it to this example where the axe is offset a little bit behind, or a little bit further back, then Anessix will spawn the companion in front of her. Now you can use this to adjust positioning against specific opponents if you know where their front line is going to be, so you can ensure that you'll spawn units in front to use with the Despite All My Rage talent and a Demon's Revenge talent. But do be wary, since Anessix herself is going to be fairly exposed and could easily be burst down if the opponents get some damage on her. Another thing to be aware of is that Anessix herself will not move at all, since she doesn't auto-attack, she doesn't aggro onto any units, unless she's forced by an opposing effect, such as a Pudge Hook or a Tiny Toss or something like that. If you box in your companion or other units into the corner, they might lose DPS by being out of range. And in general, you're going to want a more spread out approach to position with Anessix to avoid accidentally blocking your units in. So in this example here, Anessix will spawn their companion in the bottom left corner, so her left side, and it'll be unable to attack right away because it's blocked in by the other hunters plus Anessix herself. So this is actually a very bad formation. You're going to want to open this formation up or maybe move Sniper into the corner so that Anessix can spawn the ranged unit somewhere not boxed in the corner. Sniper can be boxed in since he has very long range, but the other hunters do not, and Anessix companion does not either. So that about sums it up. Anessix is a very powerful support unit, a very powerful Underlord, and she's actually slightly more powerful and slightly more popular in a lot of cases than Hobgen, just because of that early game power and the flexibility of all of her talents. Although really the power level between her and Hobgen is fairly close. You start to see a little bit of difference between the different builds, where certain builds are favored with Anessix and some with Hobgen, but really they're pretty close and both of them are pretty flexible. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please do like, subscribe, and you can also follow me on Twitch TV, where I stream almost every day. And a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. You can support me on patreon.com/tinman354 if you like content like this and want to see it keep coming. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.